Yeah.
I'm just wondering about the motivation of the explorer going into the dark continent, wanting to draw a map of the river, so that you can eventually build a railroad, et cetera, that you go through a lot of pain, a lot of difficulty as a pioneer to get the map back. If your primary assumption is that this map will never be drawn completely, where's the motivation? What does it then become?
You don't need a complete map. I mean, I'm not such a fan of Wittgenstein, but he seems to have raised his ugly head here. Wittgenstein used to say, we do not seek statements which are true. We seek statements which are true enough. That's this genuflection to the incommensurability theorem. That's as good as it gets, folks. True enough. Beyond that, there's just, the airy realm of metaphysics, which will never be plumbed. So what we're trying to do is refine our model, make it more responsive to what we want the model to tell us. But you don't want to confuse the model with the phenomenon being modeled, because it will always have dimensions which exceed the grasp of the theory.
Well, that's what the probability way of Zalman thinks as well. It says that there's a tendency for a particular state to exist, and that's as good as it gets.
Yes, although I have real problems with probability theory, which we'll probably get into tomorrow. I think that in a sense, probability theory has made it almost impossible for us to think clearly about anything, because it contains certain insidious built-in assumptions that are purely assumptions. For instance, probability theory tells you that when you flip a coin, the odds of it being heads or tails are 50-50. If, in fact, that were true, the coin would land on its edge every single time. So what we need, you see, is not a theory of what is possible. That's science. If you want to know if something is possible, you find a scientist, and they're always perfectly happy to fulfill this function and tell you whether this is possible or not. What we completely lack as a civilization is a theory that explains to us how it is, out of the vast class of possible things, certain things undergo what Alfred North Whitehead called the formality of actually occurring. We have no theory. I mean, science can say, well, it's probable that it'll be this, but it's also 40% probable that it'll be that. You say, well, which will it be? You say, well, I just told you the probabilities. Say, that's not good enough. I want to know. Say, we have no theory of selecting among the probabilities. The other problem that haunts probability theory is that it assumes that time is an absolute flat plane. It assumes that no physicist tells you in his lab notes, please perform my experiment on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Saturdays, because it won't work any other time. In other words, the assumption is made that the experiment will produce the data predicted by theory no matter when the experiment is performed. In other words, it's assumed that the phenomena is time independent. But that's just an assumption that Newton got into. Proving that phenomena are time independent is absolutely beyond our intellectual reach. It can't be done. A curious thing about probability theory is, say you want to know how much current is flowing through a wire. Here's how probability theory finds out. It measures the current flowing through the wire with a meter. It measures it 1,000 times. It takes those values and adds them together. Then it divides by 1,000. Then it tells you this is how much current is flowing through the wire. You look at the value they've given you and you say, but we took 1,000 measurements and we never got this number. Say, well, that's because, you didn't average the probability. And, well, if we took 1,000 measurements and not one is the value you're offering, why should we believe that this is the amount of current flowing through the wire? Well, then there's a bunch of hand-waving and epistemic foot stamping and so forth. Science is an incredibly fragile edifice, which if it weren't for its ability to hand its findings on to technologists who make pretty things, it would have to take its place somewhere to the left of, homeopathy, acupressure, something like that. In other words, it is not a meta-theory. It has not got truth by the jugular. It has a bunch of fishy mathematical formula which it's flailing you with, but I think that serious revision of probability theory is going to have to take place.
I think you've given probability theory much more than it's really there. Inherently, what it's all about is simply acknowledging the fact that there are variables in anything that we can't know, and we don't know.
Well, another thing probability theory says is that chance has no memory. And so they always, in first-year statistics, they say, if you flip a coin and it comes up heads 49 times, what are the odds it will come up heads the 50th time? The answer is 50-50. But any gambler would tell you that, if it comes up heads 5 times in a row, bet on heads, for crying out loud. So there's something...
I'm not an acolyte of probability or statistics, because I think a lot is done or inferred from them that just doesn't exist. I agree. At the same time, really all that's at the basis is the notion that there are things going on here that we can't know, even though that's not acknowledged by most people who are practicing it. That's the reality of probability or statistics.
But don't you think the other assumption is that time is a non-inputting, it's not variable? That you don't say the odds of the coin coming up heads or tails are 50-50 in Canada, but 48-52 in Bolivia.
That's one of the variables that's sort of smeared out simply because it can't be characterized the way people who are doing that like to tend to characterize. But underlying the whole thing is still the notion that there are things going on here that we can't know.
Oh, well, I don't have any trouble with that. I understand why science latched on to probability with such a vengeance. It's because, thanks to William of Ockham, there is this notion called Occam's razor, which is this idea that is most simply stated as hypotheses should not be multiplied without necessity. So since the idea that time is a flat invariant is the simplest assumption, try it first and see if it works. But I maintain that, science has, in certain areas, been very slow to make progress in the social domain, in econometrics, in the, multiple body problems and stuff like that. Well, I think this is because this simple assumption that time is an invariant has to be re-examined. I would offer a new definition of science. Science is that field of human endeavor which studies phenomenon so crude that they are time invariant. The hydrogen atom cleaves from the oxygen atom the same way every time. But love affairs don't come apart the same way every time. Bankruptcies don't occur the same way every time. These are complex, compound phenomena that are then influenced by the temporal variables and the variables embedded in the environment around them. Now, the problem is, these are the things we're interested in. Love affairs, bankruptcies, and the establishment of empires. Very few people have a passionate interest in the dynamics of the water molecule.
Except that that equipment over there was produced by those notions, these notebook computers, software that you're running.
Oh, now I know I have you on the run, because this is but it makes pretty things argument.
No, I'm just saying, I'm not commenting on the value of it or not. I mean, each person has to assess that for himself.
Well, see, I think science is a great enterprise and noble, but not the arbiter of truth. There are no arbiters of truth. The truth of the Tarot, the truth of quantum physics, these are truths in the supermarket of truth. But there's no top end to that process. There may not even be one truth in a given situation. If you're flipping coins, probability theory is probably a good guide. You wouldn't want to run your love affair on probability theory. So you have to choose the domain. You have to recognize the applicable tools for whatever domain you're looking at. I think that there's something that has been overlooked by science called, and I'll name it, it's called novelty. The universe is a novelty-conserving engine of some sort. From the very first nanoseconds after the Big Bang, novelty has been conserving itself and building newer and deeper levels of novelty on novelty already achieved. I mean, you have the Big Bang, then you have this era called the pre-physical era. It's brief. It lasts the amount of time it takes light to cross a distance equivalent to the diameter of the proton, electron, something dinky for sure. That's called the era before physics. Then physics begins, one jiffy after that. And the original universe was so hot that it was a plasma of free electrons. So since it was a plasma, there was nothing that you could call atomic physics, because the ambient temperature was so high that electrons could not settle down into stable orbitals around nuclei. As the temperature of the universe fell, atomic systems crystallized out of that plasmic environment. Well, then, further cooling of the universe leads to more complex kinds of bonds and the cooking out of complex elements from stars. The original universe was made entirely of hydrogen. This hydrogen aggregated into masses so large that at their centers there was actually, and if you think I'm not nervous doing this in front of you, you're crazy. These aggregates of hydrogen at the center, it was so massive in temperature and pressure that fusion could actually begin, and fusion cooked out heavier elements, iron, sulfur, and eventually carbon. Well, when you get 4-valent carbon, this throws open the doorway to tremendous new novelty. You get now, for the first time, not atomic systems, but molecular systems. These molecular systems lead into protobiological systems. Protobiological systems lead into prokaryotes, then eukaryotes, then true higher multicellular animals, then mammals, then human beings, then electronic culture, then the big surprise. Now, the thing to notice about all this is that novelty keeps building on novelty already achieved. It crosses biological lines, atomic lines, molecular lines. It is a law of the universe, I'm proposing, that novelty is conserved. And so then what we represent is the kind of ultimate nexus of novelty. And I believe that, we are being wound tighter and tighter and tighter into a confrontation with the equivalent of the singularity at the center of a black hole. But it isn't a gravitational singularity that I'm talking about. It's a novelty singularity. And so, the universe is growing toward some kind of ultimate state of boundaryless hyperconnectivity. And when that is achieved, the process will cease to be describable in the locus of ordinary space, time, and energy. Now, science has no notion of this concept of novelty. In the East, there is such a concept. It's called Tao. And Tao builds things up and pulls them down according to its own mysterious laws. Tomorrow, I will argue, when we get the computer, that its laws are not, in fact, entirely mysterious, and that we can discover the nature of the novelty constant. And instead of treating space-time as an absolutely featureless plane, we can take that zero value, which is how that shows up in the Newtonian mechanics, and substitute instead a fractal dimension number, which will be some kind of decimal fraction between 1 and 2, and then this will allow us to do things previously inconceivable, like predict the future and stuff like that. See, one thing I guess I should say, since we've sort of drifted into this fairly rappy place, is the idea that the universe is growing toward itself. It's not moving outward from its origin. It's moving toward its completion. And this is called teleology. It's very unwelcome in most scientific modeling, but that's a legacy from the 19th century where they were so concerned to get God out of the picture that they wanted everything to happen through one random process colliding with another random process and flipping out mule deer, elephants, and redwood trees. But in principle, we don't have to believe in God to believe in an attractor at the end of the process. We see many kinds of attractors in the natural world. One way that I think of the psychedelic experience is, you've heard me talk about hyperspace, superspace, this kind of thing. It really does seem to me that reality is some kind of a very complex geometric object of some sort. And you know how they teach you in trigonometry that all possible ellipses can be obtained by sectioning a cone? And that if you take the infinite set of ellipses and reconstruct them, you can reconstruct the cone. Well, the way I think of psychedelics and psychedelic tripping is you are sectioning a hyperdimensional object. And what you're coming back with is a lower dimensional map of this higher dimensional object. Well, everybody has a different map in the same way that there are an infinite number of elliptical sections of a cone, but they're all generated by the same object. And if it's a mystery to you how a simple finite object like a cone can generate an infinite number of elliptical sections, then it's going to be hard for you to understand how everybody can have a different psychedelic trip and yet be actually dealing with the same reality in hyperspace. I steal shamelessly from Alfred North Whitehead, and probably others as well, but I'm willing to cop to that. He has this notion called concrescence, which I think is a great idea. He says everything grows toward a nexus of concrescence. So complexification is at the service of concrescence. We can see how this planet is caught in a concrescent process. 100 years ago, it took 3 months to go around the world. Now it takes a third of a second. 100 years ago, a newspaper carried local news. Now local news means the news of this planet. We can telephone Prague or Shanghai by just going outside to the phone booth. We are being knitted more and more tightly together. Now most people think this is a human world phenomenon and it will stop at some point with everybody connected to everybody else, I guess. I don't think it is a process of the human world. I think we're embedded in a collapse of physical law. This is a fairly pathological notion from the point of view of most scientists, because they believe that the universe will exist for, millennia or millions of years into the future. But I think our presence on this planet indicates that we're deep into Act 3 of the cosmic drama. I mean, in a way, the problem is not the end of the universe, but why it existed in the first place. What happened to flaw the original nothingness, to contort itself into this fantastic cascade of interconnected complexity? It's very, very tricky, this stuff. Yeah.
You said earlier you were surprised that you had no competitors.
Right.
And you understand that we have a political climate that's not congenial to exploring.
True.
So why are you surprised?
Because I don't feel particularly courageous. I don't feel that this is unusual, what we're doing here. Am I crazy? Could be. It would seem to me, knowing what I know, which is no more than 1,000 other people know, I couldn't live with myself if I didn't talk about these things. Because our problem is we're disempowered, unhappy, and disconnected from ourselves and each other. Here's the solution. How can you, it's a political obligation, or it's a moral obligation to try and at least inform people. They don't have to take it, but they should at least have the facts of the matter in front of them as they live their lives. So I just do it because I couldn't do it any other way, and I'm puzzled that nobody else feels this imperative, because the people I talk to, 1,000 people have told me psychedelics were the most important thing that ever happened to them. But not one of those 1,000 people ever said, and I've scheduled a speaking tour to do the same thing that you're doing. So I don't know.
There's fear and paranoia. I hear there were even people who were afraid to come to this for revealing their interests.
Wow. Well, either I'm crazy or they are. I don't know. See, I think that is, how if you confront certain, butterflies or deer, there are certain kinds of animals that if you move slowly enough, they can't tell you're there, because they're set up for edge detection. And if you move slowly enough, they don't register the edge transiting. So you can actually walk right up to them and grab them if you know how to do it. Lizards are like this. Cats. So I think that by moving with stealth, rather than going to Harvard or Berkeley and inviting the freshman class to pour into the street and smash bank windows, that we can actually slip this thing along. I think that eventually such desperation is going to strike straight institutions that they will come to us and ask. They're going to try everything when the going gets rough, and when they finally decide to drop all their pretension, we'll be perfectly willing to have a dialogue. I'm sorry to hear that people felt that paranoid about it. I don't think the political climate is that repressive. I think people are doing the work of the man for the man by being that paranoid. For crying out loud, look at the Russians. They were able to toss out the Communist Party. Well, now that's a pretty scary thing to go up against. We don't have anything comparable to that in terms of its depth of penetration into our lives, and yet they were able to do that. I think, there's more to life than hiding out. You got to make the grand gesture at a certain point and then let the chips fall where they may. Brave words, oh boy. Basically, I think people should see these kinds of meetings as a tremendous opportunity to form local alliances. The last thing on earth we want here is a Terence McKenna cult. That would just be the stupidest resolution of the whole thing. The whole message is, you don't need me or Tim or anybody else. Just take a little metaphysical responsibility upon yourself, realize you are the microcosm of the macrocosm, and then get with like-minded people and proceed. I mean, this is how political revolutions are made, is by people just ignoring as irrelevant, outmoded social forms and structures and insisting on their own authenticity. I think people should support psychedelic communities, archival projects, legalization moves, but mainly I think what we all need to do is get more loaded. Deeper trips, higher doses. See, it's not that we want to convert the entire planet to taking mushrooms. It's that we just want to be left alone to do what we want to do. The mushroom, if it's as great as I say it is, then it doesn't need a mob clearing the way for it. It's perfectly able to advance its own agenda. The thing is just not to yield to fear. Because, as I said, if you yield to fear, you do the man's work for the man, and that makes you the man. So what you have to do is just say, well, this is what we do, and eventually it will change. I mean, gay people is a good example. I mean, in our own lifetimes, we've seen this go from, an unspeakable crime against nature, which decent people took care to not even be informed of, to, a political subculture with its own agenda and its own press and its own political clout. Well, we are not as under the thumb as gay people were, say, in the early 50s or something. If they can do it, we can do it. If black people can go from slavery to a legitimate claim on full social integration into the body politic, then we can do it too. But not if in America, nobody gets nothing unless they demand it. So as long as we bow our heads and hide our stash and are looking over our shoulder, well, then they've got us on the run. But we just have to say, look, this is it. This is who I am. If this doesn't jive with your political agenda, adjust your political agenda, because this is who we are. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned the word facilitator once yesterday, and I wanted to know what role that's played for you.
For me? Well, a lot of people feel more secure doing journeys if they have some kind of ground control. And in the most casual form, that can just be your best friend who doesn't do it, but you do. Or if you suspect that fairly deep and charged issues are going to arise out of it, why you want it to be someone with some psychotherapeutic experience. But on the other hand, you're in such a vulnerable state in that dimension that you really want to choose the facilitator carefully. I mean, and have some kind of set of agreements worked out before. I mean, the psychedelic trip doesn't always take the direction you want it to. I mean, you write down before you take it that you want to deal with some episode of childhood trauma or abandonment. Then you get loaded, and it seems so preposterous that, you can hardly contemplate the notion without laughing aloud. And the facilitator keeps trying to bring you back, say, well, you're not doing the work. We're here to do the work. Well, then you say, well, having a knockdown, drag-out fight while somebody's loaded isn't exactly the way to go either. You sort of have to feel into that issue. As I said yesterday, I can't get where I want to go in the presence of somebody else because they hold me to the surface. If I were to have my idea of the perfect facilitator situation is that they're 2 rooms away and you have something equivalent of a beeper. And then, you can beep them and they'll come in and pat you on the head and tell you that it's all right if you need that. But otherwise, they stay completely out of it. It's really nice to follow your own thought, and I think we change in the presence of another person. We create a persona, and it takes a lot of energy to maintain the persona. And in that situation, there's no reason, so why do it? Yeah.
I was wondering, since you visited the cosmos so frequently through psychedelics, have you been in a situation where you can do it without, be it, your tired or meditation? Or...
Well, not exactly. I mean, people always say, can you do it on the natch? And I sort of feel like if I could do it on the natch, I'd be alarmed enough to check myself in for some serious mental health care. It's too radical. You don't want to be able to do that on the natch.
Oh, come on now, Terence.
It's a wonderful control on it to know that it won't happen unless you take the stuff. Because it's not a mood shift or a subtle refocusing from foreground to background. It's an absolutely ontology-peeling breakthrough. See, the thing is, in the spiritual quest, all these methods, yoga and mantra, and then, all the new versions of this, the whole stance of the spiritual quester is accelerator to the floor all the time. When you switch over to this method, it's the brake pads that are going to get the workout. We psychedelic people do not strenuously exert ourselves to attain peculiar states of mind. We strenuously exert ourselves to keep the states of mind from becoming too peculiar.
Why, Terence?
Why? Because it can become so peculiar that I don't know what. Yes, that's it. It can become so peculiar that it is unspeakable. And if it's unspeakable, it's just dropped out of the social contract. If you want to be the guy on Cold Mountain who is covered with hair, who the village people occasionally see when the mist clears, when he descends to the lower levels to cut wood, you can become that Taoist immortal. What I like to say about psychedelics is once you get to this, it's no longer about seeking the answer. It's now a tougher go. Now you have to face the answer. And it's so easy to seek, this rishi, that roshi, that geshe, that guru, and all the wonderful people, and the gossip and hijinks around the ashram, and all that malarkey. But once you get to this, and it's just you and it's a whole different ball game.
You have to keep on dosing the rest of your life to stay at that level?
Well, we're talking, there are two things. The experience and the wisdom and maturity that comes from the experience. You don't have to keep dosing to do that, but to attain, maintain, and work out the implications of that. But you have to keep dosing to keep encountering the unspeakable thing that is the source of all that maturation and so forth. My gosh, everybody's agitated here, yeah.
I wondered if, in your experience in the Amazon or otherwise with shamanic culture, if you found that they were able to do this without the drugs, or whether they were even interested?
No, largely not. In the Amazon, I mean, I discussed this with people, and they said, no, you must, the plant is the teacher. I mentioned, or maybe I didn't, but there's an interesting book called Hauma and Harmeline by Flattery and Schwartz, and it discusses the ambiance of the religious attitudes of early Zoroastrianism. And they believed in what they called the Menang existence. And we're talking, 2000 BC here, and they believed there was no possible way of accessing this spiritual dimension except drugs. That was the entire way to do it. And I think it's a kind of pharmacological and energy barrier. It's good that these things are isolated from ordinary experience by the formality of having to take the compound. If they weren't, it would be flooding in upon us all the time, and we would have a hard time indeed. Yeah.
I read somewhere recently that when the people in the Amazon take ayahuasca, it is recommended they, as initial effects come on, that they practice mind control. And what I haven't seen very much is the combination of, mental practices plus taking the psychedelics, like psilocybin.
Why is there no talk of the combining of the techniques with psychedelica?
Yes, or at least little.
Well, I don't know exactly. I mean, I would certainly agree. See, I think that all religion is based on the experience of ecstasy. And a religion like Hinduism represents, to my mind, an extreme case. The roots of Hinduism are in the Soma rite. For 3,000 years, this is what Hindu religiosity was about. It was an intoxicant. Without the intoxicant, there was no connection to the mystery. Well, then, for some reason, it became tremendously hierarchically structured and constipated and dogmatic and, well, certainly dominator, if not outright fascism. And so I think all these religions have their roots in this irrational experience, but they constantly want to turn it into a real estate operation. And they do. And they do. And so, but in answer to your question, all these techniques work with psychedelics. Mantra, yantra, magical invocation, raising the kundalini, all of these things which seem so totally obscure if from this level of consciousness, it just becomes of course it works. So it seems to me the lost ingredient is the psychedelic. I mean, if you go to India and you have any illusions about sadhus, I mean, sadhus are hash heads with a line of patter, that's all. I mean, the main concern in any community of sadhus is how many chillums can you make and smoke before you fall asleep. And I've never seen a yoga text that came clean about this and said, this is basically a how to use cannabis technique. So, it's good to go to the actual place and see how it's being handled. What's going on in the Amazon is the shamans cure, they chant, they provide an exemplar for their society. But when you get seriously loaded with them and talk to them, their attitude is more like scientists. They will agree that they can cure and find lost objects and predict the weather and all that, but they don't understand how this works. They're very eager to admit that it's all a big mystery, and that beyond the cheerful set of shamanic techniques that they, the Witoto, the Warani, whoever they are, beyond the cheerful power of the conjuration of these techniques lies the absolute unknown, and they're aware of that. There's no closure in shamanism, so it sort of keeps you humble. Yeah.
You have visions on cannabis too?
If I can control myself and not do it too often. The problem is cannabis does so many other wonderful things, and I tend to use it for those other wonderful things. But if I were totally dedicated to vision, then I would only smoke once a week, because then you completely come to equilibrium. And then, you should do it the way you do all these other things. Alone in silent darkness and at high doses. Bursts of hallucination on cannabis are hard to control and predict, but sometimes they're as intense as anything can be. If you read 19th century descriptions of cannabis use by people like Fitzhugh Ludlow and the Club du Hashashin and that crowd, where they were eating the hashish, it's very clear that it was the LSD of the 19th century. I mean, nobody can read those descriptions without realizing these people were loaded for sure. They were thoroughly and completely smashed to be able to write those kinds of accounts.
So I'm just interested, you said you'd smoke a lot at the start of the mushroom trip. And I'm not sure that's a good effect in terms of getting the learning, shall we say, from the more powerful chemicals.
What it does to me is it just slightly cuts my anxiety. I'm able to let the thing unfold of its own. I don't know. I mean, I have a lifelong, intense relationship to cannabis. And I basically make my living out of being able to do feats of memory. And, cannabis is supposed to trash your memory. So I don't, maybe I'm different, but I resist any maybe I'm different argument because it's malarkey. Nobody's different enough that they can,
You speak as clearly then? I mean, I get really tongue-tied.
No, more so. My great dream is that as my powers of locution fade with old age, that cannabis will be legalized. Then I can sit in front of you and smoke, and my career can be pushed 20 years further into the future. The way I use cannabis is to think. And I do a lot of thinking. And at night, before I go to bed, I smoke, and then I play the tapes of the day, and then I understand what happened. If I didn't have cannabis, I don't think I would be sort of at sea or a kind of a space case, because I never get what somebody really meant, really intended, really had in mind, till I play the tapes stoned, and then I see, that's what the agenda was, or that's what was going on.
Sleep afterwards?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And if I don't smoke, then I'm insomniac. Yeah.
What do you think about the phenomenon of a contact high?
Oh, I think contact highs are very real. Not only contact highs, but there are also contact lows, which are very noticeable. There's a phenomenon called allophrenia. Do you know what allophrenia is? Allophrenia is when your friend is put in the hospital for schizophrenia, and you go to visit him, and you begin acting so peculiar that they don't let you out This is a common phenomenon. Misbehavior by people who have come to visit people who have been hospitalized for schizophrenia or psychosis. The best theory is that it's pheromonal. You know, there's one theory of what schizophrenia is, that schizophrenia is a pheromonal disorder. And what happens is your pheromone system goes haywire. So then you don't smell right. So then the people around you begin frowning at you, avoiding you, turning their back on you when you approach. Then you begin thinking, there's something wrong with me. I'm weird. Then you secrete more of this weird pheromone, and people get more, and a dissonance begins to happen until finally you have to be plucked out of the situation. There are psychiatrists who swear that they can diagnose schizophrenia by a sniff test. You know, they just walk over and take a hit off the side of your neck and then say, you know, lock this one up, put this one on. Yeah.
I assume that you've seen ritual art, and I'm wondering whether or not you see in any of that anything close to what your experience is.
The question is there in Huichol art a trace of this psychedelic dimension? I guess there's a trace. The problem is twofold. The problem is one of material, that with wood and beads and pitch, it's very hard to get to contort that into the object seen. And then the other thing is conceptually, you know, that it's very hard to grab and hold these very weird images. The other thing is that's happening in most traditional societies is that you operate within a canon. You know, if you're a Huichol, you have a very limited vocabulary of expression within the iconography of Huichol art. If you're a Tibetan Thangka painter, similarly, it's all laid out for you. The walls of tradition are very high. The channel is very narrow. That's why it's so interesting when an artist can transcend the momentum of their cultural position and really produce something unique. I don't see, I think, you know, the reason I like talking to artists is because all the art of the past 20,000 years is like a teacup dipped into the ocean. And yet any one of us, not particularly self-defined as artists, most of us, can access the ocean, can swim in the ocean. And so you say, you know, we all can touch the same source that these great artists must have touched. Their skill was that they were able to bring out a thimble full of this material, and the rest of us can only look at it in wonder, and then it passes by. You know, I think that we hardly have an inkling as to the real nature of the world and the real history of life on this planet. And, you know, we don't know how narrowly channeled the manifestation of organic intelligence is. Does it always have to be in a body? Does it always have to be in a body that stands upright with binocular vision? I think the real task with dealing with extraterrestrials is to know when you've got one. It's completely silly to search the galaxy with radio telescopes for a radio civilization. I mean, to my mind, that is as chuckle-headed as deciding you're going to search the galaxy for a decent Italian restaurant. I mean, it doesn't work like that. I mean, the funny thing about the extraterrestrial position is that it depends on how long it's been since you've taken mushrooms, how creditable it seems. If it's recent, it seems the only possible explanation. If you wait a few months, then skepticism and reason begins to level the landscape, and you say, well, no, it couldn't possibly really be that. But if you think about the mushroom, try to think about it objectively, it looks to me very much like a good candidate for an extraterrestrial. First of all, DNA has been known to us only since 1950, less than a century, and we're already involved in this thing called the Human Genome Project. Well, what that means is we are taking control of the scripts that write human beings. It seems to me anything we would recognize as intelligence would pass through a phase of self-analysis where it would realize that it was made out of DNA and would then sequence itself. We're about to do this ourselves. Well, that means that most extraterrestrials will be the product of their own reflexive design process. In other words, an extraterrestrial that can cross the gulf between the stars must surely then be able to control its own form. Well then, if you look at the mushroom, it's a curious combination of artifact and entity. It looks sort of manufactured. There's very little fat on that system. I mean, first of all, fungi are primary decomposers. This means that they are at the very bottom of the food chain. This makes the kind of vegetarianism espoused by Buddhists look like an orgy of slaughter, because if you're at the very bottom of the food chain, that is the only place that is absolutely karma-free. So there's the mushroom occupying the karma-free position in the food chain. Well, then it's, we've been reading about these huge mycelial clones spread under acres of soil in Michigan and Wyoming. Well, those things, what that is that's a cobweb-like network, and in the case of a psilocybin species, filled with neurotransmitter-like compounds. Can you imagine how many synaptic clamps there must be in a 1,500-acre mushroom clone? If brain size is any relationship to intelligence, then hang on, Hannah, because it means that this thing spread through the forests of the Midwest has, a brain approximate in weight to a couple of dozen gray whales. The other thing is then the spore looks perfectly designed to sustain itself in outer space. If you want to store spores for longevity, you create conditions as close to the conditions in outer space as you possibly can. High vacuum, very low temperature. The casing of a spore is one of the most electron-dense organic materials in nature. So electron-dense that it approximates a metal. Well, global currents can form on the quasi-metallic surface of an airborne spore, and they act as a further repellent for hard radiation. So, percolating through the galaxy at an ordinary rate typical of stellar material, a mushroom species could percolate from one side of the galaxy to the other in under 400,000 years. Well, that's lightning speed compared to the size and age of the universe. If we were to gain the power to design ourselves, I think after a whole bunch of Madonna and Robert Redford clones, we would probably move on to becoming something very much like a mushroom. It's, mild, it's non-invasive, it's at the bottom of the food chain, it's virtually immortal, it's laden with neurotransmitters, and it's living in the imagination. And this, brings me to a favorite subject of mine. This is where we have to go. We have to enter into the Blakean divine imagination. That's where our future lies. At this point, our relationship to this planet as infant to child is a relationship of impending toxemia. We have to be parted from the mother to save the mother and to save us. And there are not that many possibilities. Where are we going to go? You know, I put it this way to somebody the other night. The question was, is the earth our mother, therefore to be cared for into her old age, nurtured, revered, and loved? Or is the earth our placenta, therefore to be examined for signs of toxin and then buried under the apple tree? In other words, what is the true nature of human beings? Are we to be integrated into nature and to celebrate it? Or is nature a demonic and titanic force that is imprisoning spirit and holding it back from its full unfolding in worlds of alien light and higher dimension, so far from here that it's a miracle that even rumor reached us of the possibility of salvation? This is a tough choice, because one path leads to a radical renunciation of technology, radical pairing of population, and an attempt to come to terms with this small liquid planet on which we find ourselves. And the other direction says, forget it. It's the husk of a seed. And it is utterly meaningless in the cosmic drama. And the real destiny lies out there, halfway to Zenebel Ganubi or Zeta Reticuli or some other exotic port of call. I don't see how you can have that both ways. You want to be very careful with your political agenda. One of my sub-interests, which sort of has a relationship to this, but it's oblique, is asteroidal impacts. I think asteroidal impacts are one of the great undiscussed factors in evolution, that every solid body in the solar system is heavily cratered with impacts by infalling bodies. There's this thing down in Arizona that only happened 50,000 years ago. It was a piss-ant-sized object, and everything within 800 miles of the impact point died instantly. It dug a hole half a mile into the ground. It was a nothing burger. This thing which came down 65 million years ago, they now think on the Yucatan, everything on the earth larger than a chicken died. You want to talk about ecotastrophe. You can't even conceive of what it's like when something like that happens to a planet. They estimate that at the velocity this thing must have been traveling, it was 5 miles into the planet in the first second and a half. It raised a wall of rock 6,000 feet high that moved outward at Mach 7. And the planet rang for 1 million years, but if it hadn't been for that, there would be no flowering plants, no triumph of the mammals. There's all this tumult in our psyche about the great change that's supposed to happen, and where are we supposed to put our political energies, and what are we supposed to be doing? Well, it would be pretty ironic if we, beat ourselves over the head and save the rainforest and all this malarkey, and then something came down and just turned the whole thing into hash. Then people would say, my God, how could we have been so stupid? We should have been extracting and sequestering U-235 and plutonium. We should have been building starships the size of Montana. We should have been sparing no effort. And what did we do? We replanted rainforests, and now look, the whole thing. So you have to, good intentions are not sufficient. You have to locate where the threat is coming from and act accordingly. There are no points for good intentions in the game of evolution. And we have to decide, what does life want? Is it that life at its most basic level senses the finite duration of the star's life, and so it wants to use this moment of sunshine to build something that could carry us out into the mainstream of the galaxy, to the denser star fields? Or, is that some kind of titanic, Apollonian, male-dominated, techno-fascist, materialist trip? And what we need to do is cultivate gentleness and attention to the bugs and the grasses and the water. I don't have an answer to that. I think it's a real dilemma. I think people who think they do have answers haven't really connected with how ambiguous the situation really is.
Can you do both?
How can you do both?
What says the mushroom?
Well, what the mushroom says is it's a total apocalyptarian. I mean, it says, rouse your camels, pack your tents, we're moving out. This has been fine for a while, but ahead lie worlds of unimaginable challenge at great distance. But, of course, the mushroom sounds like a techno-fascist, hortatory male dominator when it talks like that. You take ayahuasca and it says, clean up the rivers, care for the children, replant the forest. Well,
but then you have to look at the mushroom, possibly being the universal traveler that it is. It has that urge. It's got the wanderlust. So of course it's going to be a conflict.
That's right. It has nomadic ethics.
Right.
So it pushes nomadic solutions. Where the ayahuasca, an enormous jungle plant, a flowering plant, a creature born out of the last catastrophe, just like we are, has a different agenda. No, the demons are of many kinds. Some are made of ions, some of mind. The ones of DMT, you'll find, stutter often and are blind. It means, somebody once said of channeling, just because somebody's dead doesn't mean they're smart. So, it could be, everybody has their own agenda. Question.
Speaking of cosmological threats, are you aware of Fred Hoyle's work?
The panspermia theory.
Yeah, and Hoyle has an impressive array of statistics that link cometary presence in near orbit to viral disease.
Yeah, well, I think that the next revolution in biology is so obvious that you can be totally radical and completely confident you're on safe ground and say the next great revolution in biology is the realization that space is not a barrier to life, and that technology is only one method for traversing between the stars. If, in fact, planets are regularly pulverized by cosmic catastrophes, then they must be like bursting seed pods. And everything is subjected to a tremendous evolutionary hammering, but spores, viruses, stuff like that, particulate matter, it just drifts out between the stars, and then when it finds another suitable environment, it breaks out. We don't know what the constraints on life are. The oceans of Europa could harbor life. These hot vent, sulfur vent organisms that we find in the deep oceans here, they could survive in the oceans of Europa. If there were hot sulfur vents at the bottom of those oceans, those organisms wouldn't bat an eye. No, there's more mystery than anything else. For example, just as an example, if our destiny lies out in the great universe, it's a hell of a technological barrier to cross to the stars. It may be insurmountable. However, isn't it interesting that the most Earth-like star within 70 light years is the nearest star? Not technically the nearest star, which is a glowing red clinker called Alpha Centauri, right? But Beta Centauri is 1.1 solar masses. 1.1 solar masses. No star within 70 light years is as sun-like as that star. From the point of view of the galaxy, Beta Centauri and our sun almost look like lightly bounded binaries. If this is an accident, it's a tremendously fortuitous accident for us, because it may well mean that there is an Earth-like planet at an incredibly short distance away from us in terms of the cosmic neighborhood. In fact, telescopes of sufficient resolving power will be created that if there is a water-heavy, oxygen-rich world out there, it's going to show up. Well, then that is going to become a tremendous attractor in the historical matrix, because it will be hailed as the answer. I mean, can you imagine? Because there will then be two possibilities: that there is intelligence next door, not likely, or that there is, but likely, how do you assess it? How many water-heavy, oxygen-rich planets have we examined, for crying out loud? And the other possibility is that it's empty real estate. In either case, it will excite keen interest throughout society. So, that's a little oddness in our cosmic neighborhood that is rarely mentioned or taken account of. But there may be mysteries. I mean, one question that I'm surprised nobody ever seems to ask in these weekends, when I tell the cheerful story of the descent from the trees, the ape encounter with the mushrooms, and so forth and so on, is nobody ever asks, well, but who put the mushrooms in the path of these binocular, bipedal, evolving primates? I mean, is this just the story of nature's happiest accident? Or did someone say, tweak the planet, start the retraction of the rainforests, seed the spores into the grasslands, and watch what happens? Because then we come down out of the trees, brainless as a wombat, and begin testing food sources, and lo and behold, here are these things which are obviously designed to be seen. I mean, mushrooms are a form of display. They're designed to be seen. They demand to be eaten. And the consequences of that, are to lead a species to the brink of starflight. Well, is that just a coincidence, or is there a mind behind all of this? See, I think that the problem I have with all the extraterrestrial scenarios and all the channeling and all the abducting and all the stuff that goes on is it's all too B-movie. It's all too simple, too straightforward. That's what troubles me about the Sitchin scenario, is that it's perfectly understandable to us. If it's understandable to us, you can bet your booties it's the wrong answer. I mean, it's going to be weirder than that. It's not about mineral extraction or even diplomatic goodwill. I had a professor years ago, his cosmology went like this. You know how there are bacteria which you can introduce into gold slurry in low-grade gold ore, and the bacteria will concentrate the gold, and then you just wash the gold out of the bacteria, and it's a mining technique that's very efficient for poor-yielding gold ore. So this guy's idea was that someday UFOs would appear over every major city on Earth, and they would just load up all the plutonium and fissionable material and take it away and say, thank you very much. This mining operation is now concluded. You people can go back to hurling shit at each other in the treetops as far as we're concerned. We have real application for this fissionable material. You people were going to use it to blow each other up. What a bunch of dummies. And farewell and good luck. So that's one possibility.
Can I ask one thing, Terence?
Yes, then I insist on getting to these plans.
You mentioned a book called Something in Harmaline by Fletcher?
No, Haoma, 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 and Harmaline by, by Flattery and Schwartz.
Thanks.
And it's published by the University of California Press, Near Eastern Studies Division, publication number 23. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you how you see the role of ritual.
Well, I don't have a very popular position on ritual, and I blame it on the mushroom, because I just quote the mushroom. And I said, what about ritual? And it said, that's fine if you don't know what you're doing. And I think that it's really not an anti-ritualist position, because that is what ritual is. That's what you do if you don't know what you're doing.
How many of us really know what we're doing?
None of us. But the purpose, you can tell when ritual works because it makes itself obsolete. Well, even in the most ritualistic context, there's always a footnote made for the crazy wisdom. I mean, every great teacher has said that what he's saying is malarkey. A teacher who doesn't tell you that what he or she is saying is malarkey is not to be taken seriously. So, it's if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him style of thinking. Or I was just reading this guru who's coming on strong. This guy said, don't do practice. Don't do practice. Practice is only distraction. He said, we have to keep thinking up. He said, running an ashram isn't easy. These students, they expect so much of us. We have to continually keep inventing stuff to keep them happy and send them off on these crazy quests and endless fasts and all this stuff because they want that. But, the guru is pretty much content to kick back with the latest Rolling Stone. Yeah.
Memory serves me correctly. I think I saw in one of the handouts that you're doing something with Sheldrake. Could you comment on that? I'd like to know a little bit about it.
Well, are you all familiar with Rupert Sheldrake's work? Sheldrake is a British biologist who's written a number of books. His first book was called A New Science of Life, and it was catapulted to fame by virtue of a review in Nature, which said that it should be burned. And then he wrote a book called The Presence of the Past. Sheldrake has an extraordinarily simple, interesting, revolutionary idea that just drives scientists straight up a tree. His idea is that once something happens, it's easier for it to happen the next time.
The neural pathway's been created.
Yes, simple. But it takes then forms which drive people crazy, because he asserts, based on that if you teach rats to run a new kind of maze in Australia, then rats in Massachusetts should be able to run this maze faster than if the rats in Australia hadn't learned it. Because once something has occurred, then it has a momentum in time. He calls this the theory of formative causation, or morphogenesis. And it explains a lot of things which are otherwise very difficult for biology to explain. But it raises also a bunch of issues that are pretty tricky. And so Rupert and I have been close friends for years, and even longer, I've been tight with a mathematician in Santa Cruz named Ralph Abraham, who's a chaos dynamicist. And Ralph and Rupert and I did a book together called Trialogues at the Edge of the West. And we'll all get together at Esalen the end of August and do a bunch more of these public three-way dialogues, which are pretty spirited because we're very different people from each other, but all psychedelic and all interested in paradigm recasting. So that's what it's about.